All right, well, thanks very much to AMPC and also the sponsors of the conference. It's a privilege to be able to speak on behalf of the meat industry. Many of you obviously represent. So today I'm going to be talking about reducing non-tariff barriers to trade, and some of this language gets a little bit difficult, so I'll try and navigate some of that. But just to put it into perspective, I work for, obviously, the Australian Meat Industry Council, as already stated. My background is market access, so I do have a reasonable understanding of negotiating agreements, especially from the government to government level, but more recently from the industry perspective. And the other thing about today's talk, we will have some hot off the press updated non-tariff barrier figures. So for those that are interested in the stats, the nuts and bolts, there'll be some new information here. So today I'm going to talk about the challenges of non-tariff barriers to trade, and I'll go into the definition a little bit in a minute. I'm also going to talk about what the red meat processing sector is actually doing about those non-tariff barriers to trade, and also I'll just finish with a couple of case studies just to put into perspective how these non-tariff barriers to trade actually practically impact our Australian processors. Market access is our number one priority for the industry. There's obviously many other priorities there that we've seen earlier from Peter's talk, and certainly that puts the international competitive environment into perspective as well. But I just wanted to start off with a positive note, because sometimes you can get a bit negative about these non-tariff barriers to trade. But just as a positive note, and I think this is working, this is a graph from ABARE's report, What China Wants in 2050. So it's a great report. They've also done a couple of other reports for Indonesia and India as well, and they're very good reading, especially about the strategic environment. The future is bright, and some of this came out with some of Peter's talk. But we can see there, just very grossly speaking, Asia, we're expecting a doubling of the demand for agri-food by 2050, and of course a lot of that will be driven by China, though we're hoping also India picks up, especially with its recent economic growth. India's looking quite impressive as well, and we don't want to forget about the rest of Asia as well. But I guess the focus is on the Asian region and that burgeoning middle-class consumer that's probably going to go from about 600 million, depending on how you measure it, to 3 billion by 2030. So I'll talk about non-tariff barriers, and it's something I've been working on, I guess, for the last 2 years. Just to give you a very quick definition, we're really happy with the FTAs, great trifecta in obviously in North Asia there with China, Japan and Korea. We're really happy with those tariff reductions and hopefully the removal of quotas, though we still have some quotas in place in some markets. But the reality is, if you don't have market access or you have burdensome other barriers, then basically that market access win doesn't mean a lot to you personally as a company. So non-tariff barriers to trade are these suite of items that sit outside the traditional tariffs and quotas that are dealt with under free trade agreements. I won't go into all the language, but you'll hear government use the term non-tariff measures, which are legitimate barriers, if you like, to trade. Countries still have the right, obviously, to set their own food safety standards, etc., etc. So I guess the flip side of that coin is non-tariff barriers to trade, and that's really what we're talking about. There is a little bit of, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so one person's non-tariff measure is another person's non-tariff barrier, but I'll probably hone in fairly quickly on what we think are are actually non-tariff barriers to trade. There's a lot of interest. I won't go into all the details about some of the other organisations that are looking at non-tariff barriers. It's certainly, I guess it's a sexy term at the moment, even if we might not know what it means. And APEC, interestingly enough, have just commenced their study into non-tariff barriers to trade across the region. The key thing about it is that the red meat processors have funded a resource to try and tackle non-tariff barriers to trade. Now, when I start putting up some figures, I think it'll probably put into perspective how big or how daunting this task is. The red meat processing sector established this Industry Market Access Advisory Committee, and this is actually funded by AMPC. And it's been going now for about 18 months, coming up to 2 years, and that committee decided that the strategic focus or focus markets would be China, the Middle East and Indonesia, and Indonesia we've sort of added more recently. That's not to certainly put aside the other markets, so US, Japan, Korea, all EU are obviously fantastic markets for us, and I guess there's a sweeping generalisation, and the devil is in the details with some of this. The so-called non-tariff barriers to trade into those mature markets are known. We've traded for a long time, and the impact, and this has actually been analysed, as I'll talk about in a minute, the impact in those mature markets is a lot less than it is in these emerging markets. So understandably so, there's a trend with emerging markets increasing non-tariff barriers to trade, and certainly from our perspective, we will look at all markets and try to work across market access issues with all markets, but as a strategic focus, we'll be sort of focusing heavily on these three areas. And I'll talk a little bit about the competitors into these markets as well, and where, frankly speaking, Australia is getting a bit of a raw deal. So just a little bit about what we've been doing. I won't get too much into the diagram, but the latest report, and we've had an updated report on non-tariff barriers to trade in the red meat industry, indicates that they're now worth over $3.4 billion. Now, some of you have a little bit of history on this. We started off at $1.25 billion in 2013, and guess what? 3 years later, we've got more non-tariff barriers, not less, and we're actually valuing them at nearly $3.5 billion. I won't go into the breakdown of that, but that's sort of hot off the press. That report hasn't been released yet, but we're just working through the final details. What the red meat industry did was, in response to this, was actually to set up a resource that would act as a go-between, mainly between government, and that's the Australian government, and industry, to try and actually get some focus on this. One, strategic focus, but two, actual set up projects that would actually tackle some of the big non-tariff barriers, not necessarily the biggest in value, but certainly those ones that we thought we could actually achieve a fair bit. It's not to say that this resource doesn't work with the overseas governments, but largely speaking, as you probably understand under government protocol, you still try and work through the government. Now, I'll just put that nearly $3.5 billion figure into perspective. That's 15% of the GDP of the red meat processing sector, or the red meat industry, in general. So we're talking about a $23 billion industry that's nearly half of agricultural GDP, and you've got this millstone around us at about 15% of the cost of the industry. So just trying to highlight, this is a sizable problem. It's not a little problem. And you might dispute how we come to the figures, but in the end, you can't deny that there is a reasonable impact there. I'll just talk a little bit briefly about what we've been trying to do in some of the markets. So with the resource that we've allocated to tackle these non-tariff barriers, we've tried to get that resource really to act as a coordinator across a number of bodies, whether it be the different industry bodies or whether it be the Australian government. There's a lot of work with the Australian government, but also we've tried to establish direct industry links with some key, what we consider to be key organisations in China. Certainly, and I won't go through all the acronyms there, but probably the most obvious ones, those that are involved in imports and those that are the China Meat Association, that's obviously an analogous industry body to the one that I represent. We have also tried to obviously indirectly or sometimes more directly work with the Chinese government, especially on audits and those sorts of things. We did run some, and I won't go into all the details, but we've run some workshops up in China where we directly communicated with the Chinese government. Just a little bit about the Middle East. Probably the thinking there is that there's sort of these ever-expanding circles like a ripple effect. We've got Saudi Arabia and UAE, which are key markets for us, but certainly Saudi is one of the sort of markets where we've highlighted there is a significant cost to non-tariff barriers to trade. But we're very engaged with the GCC. It's a huge potential, but they're already important markets in their own right. But what we're looking at is the drag effect of these non-tariff barriers to trade. And then more broadly speaking, there's the region, including North Africa. So there's 40-odd countries in that region, 18 countries that we're focused on, but there's 40-odd countries in that region. Probably one of the key ones to highlight, and we'll see this in a minute, is Egypt. It's a 100 million population. Whilst there's political instability there, it's actually a huge potential market for us. So I won't go through every project that we're doing, but these are just some of the figures of what some of these, what we're calling non-tariff barriers to trade, are costing us. So the restrictions on the chilled meat trade into China, where currently we only have 11 establishments that can send chilled meat product to China. We're costing that at about 40 million bucks. And that's a cost, obviously, to those that can't get access, that desperately want access. And there's plenty of people, obviously, who want access to China. I'll highlight this one in a minute. There's also the tripe ban into China. So I think Peter already alluded to the fact that I think Ted as well alluded to the fact that there's already some indirect access. We won't talk about the indirect access, but we're trying to get legitimate access into China with tripe through the front door. A couple of projects into the GCC. This one might seem a little one, but it's actually a bigger, audacious goal of trying to get truly paperless trade and electronic transfer of information into the GCC countries, whilst getting rid of the burdensome sort of hard copy stamping of health certificates. I just mentioned Egypt as an important part of the world for us, so we've got a project going into Egypt there. 3 minutes, thank you. I think I'll be finished in 3. Just picking up on Indonesia as well, there's a couple of key issues that we're focused on there. You may think this is a bit of an outlier, Mexico and flat stacking of sheep and goat carcasses. I threw that in there because that's a project that IMAC has supported, and I guess it's trying to give the idea that we are flexible. If we can see an opportunity, we think it's going to be possible to kick over a non-tariff barrier to trade, the industry advisory committee will move accordingly. So I'll just give you the first case study in terms of international competition, and it's the listing restrictions into China. So they're costing us nearly 200 million bucks, and there's two main costs in there. The first cost is the cost of actually getting auditors out to look at each individual establishment, and then the time it takes to list the establishments, and then there's a cost to the actual establishments that are restricted in terms of access. So we've got 47 out of, well, it depends on your numbers in the day, 88 processors that can actually send product to China. Our major competitors into the market are New Zealand, Uruguay and Brazil. I won't mention that too much because that's a sad story for us, where Brazil has literally just flown past us in terms of exports of beef into China. But the key thing is that there's a couple of countries that have an advantage on us on non-tariff barriers. Firstly, New Zealand, because they do have listing of virtually all their processors. We don't. They have recognition of their system, and we can talk about the devil in the detail of that. But the reality is Australia still has to go through this cumbersome listing process. We have Brazil that's just regained access, and Ted again alluded to it, despite the sort of dubious FMD status and the concerns there. So, basically China has traditionally only accepted product from FMD-free countries. So we're at a competitive disadvantage, obviously on price because of our high cost of production, but we've been knocked out because we're not getting the same sort of treatment on the non-tariff barriers. We have a little bit of an advantage at the moment on chilled product, but if you believe New Zealand, that's going to slowly dissipate, or quickly dissipate possibly. I'll just pick on Indonesia as well. It's a very important market for us. It's our 5th largest beef market. Do send a modest amount of sheep product there as well, so we shouldn't discount that. But India's gained access there, and there's no doubt in terms of Indian buffalo. It's not really beef. They've gained access. Foot and mouth disease affected. Indonesia's FMD free, and actually Australia's invested a lot in the past in Indonesia's FMD status. So it's a bit disappointing that we get knocked off, and it's purely a price thing. We can understand that, access to cheap protein, fair and equitable trade. We don't have a problem with that, but now we're competing against a competitor that doesn't have the same clean green status as us. I won't go too much into the live cattle issue, but we have intermittent restrictions into Indonesia. At the moment it's reasonably good, but we do have intermittent restrictions into Indonesia where we get bans on secondary cuts and offal, which obviously Indonesia is our largest live cattle market, yet some of the products that come from those cattle we can't get in. So despite the relaxation of the bans, the temporary relaxation, we do have still some delays in issuing of permits. So I guess the concluding statement for me is that we've got 2 case studies there which show that we don't necessarily get the fair trade that we should. We should trade on our clean green status. It's very important and it's vital to our customers, but sometimes we don't get the benefit that we should with a couple of those key markets. And thank you for your time.